Hi, I'm Russ with ESBService.com, and today I'm going to show you how to troubleshoot the contactor on your ESB tanning bed. For this demonstration, we've removed the cover so it's easy for you to see working on the electronics here, and your perspective is from the rear of the bed where the main power cords come in. If you suspect a bad contactor, the symptoms in your bed might be where, say, the timer system appears to be running just fine. If you have a digital timer, your main timer would come on, it would respond, it would look like you're actually turning your bed on just fine, but the bed would never actually turn on. No lamps would come on or anything like that. It could be caused by different problems, but you would be right in suspecting that your contactor is bad if you have that type of a symptom. If you don't have that type of a symptom, then you probably don't have a bad backup timer. Now, what I'm describing to you is the same for 120 or 240 volt models. When you observe the contactor, you'll see that basically you have a lot of wire connections going on, and there's this plunger that comes up and down that actually turns the bed on if you have the bed plugged in. Now, some models don't have the plunger, or actually they do, but they're covered by, there's a protective cover here. Technically, you could remove that cover, as I'm doing here. And when you do so, you'll see here's your plungers. This actually is a double pole contactor as opposed to this one being a single pole. Either is fine, but if you have a single pole contactor, you need to make sure that your hot wires or the black wires are connected here where the connection opens and closes. Here, where the bar goes all the way through, this is where you would wire the neutral wires or the white wires there. But if you have a double pole contactor, it's just as fine. They both interchange. That's the only thing is with a single pole, you would wire the opening and closing connection on the hot wires here. So this is another version of the same contactor here. But basically, when people suspect that there's something wrong, something that they might do is actually push the contactor and they would see that the bed comes on. And I can assure you that that does not test the contactor. Pushing the contactor is not a test of if the contactor is good or not. All that is testing is if everything after your contactor in the circuit is okay. And in an ESB tanning bed, everything after your contactor is your fans, your ballasts, and your lamps. So again, pushing it in is just forcing the connection to happen, and that is not an electrical test. Although you can use it to test the rest of the circuit, the proper way to test the contactor itself to see if it's working is to see if it has the voltage needed for it to pull itself in by itself without you pushing it. So the way that that happens is by applying the voltage to the coil terminals here. The coil is where you have two terminals on either side of the contactor here. This would be the primary where the power comes in, and this would be the secondary where the power leaves. But this here is the coil. Again, if you look very closely at a contactor like this, you can see these two terminals are electrically the same because they are bridged by this spot right here. And one wire goes down to one side of this coil. On the opposite side is the same thing. These two terminals are electrically the same, and there's one wire that goes down to this coil. When you energize this coil of the contactor, it creates a magnetic field which pulls this plunger in and makes the connection that we need for the bed to turn on. So basically, in order for us to test to see if the contactor is good or not, we just have to see if it is getting the voltage at the coil terminals here. So what we're going to do is this. I'm going to first note that right off of the neutral primary coming into the contactor here, there's a jumper wire. And this jumper wire goes right here to the neutral side of the coil to give the neutral side a constant neutral for that circuit. So all that needs to happen is hot needs to be applied to the opposite side of the coil in order for this to engage and turn the bed on. So since these two here are electrically the same and these two here are electrically the same, while I leave these two wires connected, I can take my voltmeter and just probe across these two empty terminals here. Now, when you do this, you would need to have the bed plugged in and the timer, the main timer system would need to be activated. So you need to be very careful when you're probing for voltage in these areas for obvious reasons. Now, at the coil, you should have the same voltage that's at your receptacle. And you should be able to verify that here at the hot and neutral screws coming in. 120 volt beds should have roughly 120 volts there, and 240 volts, same thing, 240 volts there. So whatever voltage you have here when the bed is plugged in, when you activate the timer, you should have that same voltage here across the coil terminals. If you do not have voltage here, that does not necessarily mean that you have a bad contactor. Actually, I would suspect something else. Either your backup timer or your main timer. But if you do have your voltage across the coil terminals and the contactor is not pulling in, if it's not turning the bed on, then you have a bad contactor and it would need to be replaced. Technically, you could unplug the bed and then take your hot and neutral wires and connect them directly to the coil of the contactor, like this. And when you do this, and you plug the bed in, from the main power cord, the black to the black side of the coil, the hot side, and the white to the neutral side of the coil, with the power cord jumped right to the contactor, and then you plug this in, that contactor should close. And if it does not close, then the contactor is definitely bad. Also, what would be bad for a contactor would be if you have the proper voltage here, but then the contactor is chattering and the lamps are flickering. If you have the proper voltage here and the contactor is failing like that, then again, the contactor itself would need to be replaced. Okay, so just a quick note specifically on these contactors here. You have on this single pole here, we have the hots or the blacks on this side and the neutrals and the whites on this side here. This determines that this is the primary where the power cord comes in and this is the secondary where it goes out. On a contactor like this, if you have two poles on it, technically you could reverse it around like that to where this is your hot side and that's your neutral side, or again, if you rotate it around, the same thing. When you initially wire it, that will determine as far as the hot and the neutral side of the contactor. When you have a dual pole like this, where you have a single pole, this will always be your neutral side, if you will. So again, a contactor that has two poles, technically it could be reversed, but the main point is all the hots are on one side and all the neutrals are on the other side here.